Hey guys, today we're going to do the elements of art. This specific PowerPoint or this lecture tends to be a little bit long, so just a fair warning. Trying to think what else to say. No, that's about it. So just go ahead and get started. So let me go ahead and share the screen. So elements of art. Elements of art basically are the building blocks of the composition of all art out there, right? It is a kind of the main building blocks, kind of basically the cells that put together the artworks. Now, one of the things about elements of art is that artists tend to use quite a bit of them when creating artworks. However, some of the more delightful ones, especially when it comes down to um, minimalism and all the artworks that are very minimalistic, is that they actually use very little but very well done. And the first one we're going to be talking about is going to be line. Line is the most basic of elements. And it's line by definition is a continuous mark made on a surface by a moving point. So if you think about it, if you have like the point of the cursor, right, and then I drag it, and if I had something that was leaving a mark, then that would be a line. Now, this is definition, obviously, for art, but not the one for mathematics, which are going to be different, right? Because the one for mathematics, right, you would have to say kind of, the line would be kind of a subsection, not a subsection, but the area between 2 points, right, with a line, or a series of points in space, or there's a few other definitions on there. But for us here in art, this is the best definition for line. As I mentioned earlier, line is the most basic of elements of art. Not only is it the most basic, but it's kind of the Swiss Army knife elements of art, because line can do a lot of things for an artist, right? Line can define space, can create outlines, patterns, it can imply movement or texture, and allude to mass or volume. So there's a lot of things that one single element of art can do. Some of the other ones may be able to get to one or two ways in which they interact, but specifically line can do quite a bit. Now, one of the things about line, and this is kind of silly, but line has length and is relative to its width. If not, then we have a dot or a circle or a square, right? We don't have a line. So it has to, one area has to be longer than the other for it to be a line. So pretty simple in that one. So this is going to sound, once again, very elemental, very kind of basic. However, it's good to understand really what it means, because this is some of that vocabulary that I had discussed, when we first started the class, that you have to unlearn or learn more on the vocabulary that you already have. So the very first one is a straight line. Well, pretty simple, right? Straight line, it's not a big deal. The one thing you have to understand is that we also call straight lines directional lines. And why is that? Well, because if I was to put a horizontal line, for example, right? See if I can draw with that. And there you go. Right? If I do a horizontal line, which way is that line moving? Well, you can possibly say left and right, right? So that's a direction, left and right. Now with vertical, right, then we're talking about a direction up and down. Okay. What about now diagonal, right? Same thing. So diagonal, you can talk about upwards movement or downwards movement. And that's the reason why we call it directional. Now, curved lines, as the name mentions it, right, it basically creates a curve. Now, we do have two different kinds of curved lines. We have spiral and circular. So what is the difference between a spiral and a circular line? So let me show you what a spiral line looks like, right, versus a circular line. So what is the difference between one and the other? That spiral line intersects, right? So we have an intersection there, and it's spiral, right? While circular tends not to intersect with one another. With jagged lines, is lines that have a very sharp end, right? So that would be a jagged line of some sort. Now we have kind of a section and a subsection. One of them is going to be an angular line, and that's similar to what I just drew, right? So angular lines. However, a zigzag is an angular line that has a pattern. So, right, so this is, no, not quite, but you know what I mean. So this is going to be a zigzag line. A zigzag line is an angular line that has a pattern. And there is pattern right there. And I don't think we have to go very deep on pattern, right? It's repetition of objects or elements, right, that are similar to one another. Now, implied, that's a very important one. You're going to hear the word implied quite a bit throughout art, because art is, as you have seen, is really an altered reality, right? It's not really what you see, it's beyond that. So there's a lot of things in art that are implied. Line is one of those things that you can imply. So for example, if I drew that right here, right? What kind of shape, kind of, is this, right? What kind of shape is that? And you'll probably say a square, right? And the reason for that is because your mind kind of creates the, right, this lines that don't exist. Well, that space where your brain kind of fills in the information to create a line that does not exist, that is an implied form. And in this case, we have an implied line. Okay. So that's what an implied line means. And like I said, we're going to see implied shapes and all kinds of different things throughout the semester, especially in this PowerPoint. So let's take a look at this artwork. And this is by Borowski. It's an artwork, and what we're looking at is going to be this right here. Look at this right here. This is the artwork. This is a building, and this is also a building, but the artwork itself is this very strong line right here with this figures walking out. So in your exam, you're going to be asked to describe line. How is line being used? So that is going to be the hardest thing for you, is to make sure that you're not describing the line, but telling me how it's being used, right? So if it's a difference of saying, for example, how is a coffee, how do you work a coffee machine, right? So the way you use a coffee machine is you add the water, you add the coffee, and you press the button and so forth, right? That's how you use it. I wouldn't answer that question by saying that, oh, the coffee pot is black and it's got silver spots and it has a clear side. That's not how you use a coffee pot, right? You're describing it. That's the thing that you're going to have to be really careful with your exam, that you're not describing things, but you're telling me how they're being used. Make sure you're answering the questions correctly. So back to what I was talking about with the artwork, right? How is line being used in this specific artwork, right? How is it being used? And then at the same time, just for the sake of it, we're going to describe it as well. But remember, for the exam, they're asking you how it's being used. So first of all, how would you describe this line, right? Would you consider it to be a thick line, a thin line, right? And in this case, we will consider it fairly thick. Now, what is the scale? Where are we seeing the scale or the proportion from? In this case, well, it's going to be proportional to these figures, right? So if it's a line that is, quarter the size of a human figure, then it's pretty thick, right? Now, we can also describe it as a rigid line, right? It's very strong. You can also call it directional, right? And then you will have a directional descriptor, right? So it's a diagonal directional. Some of you may say, well, it's also an implied line. Why? Because it may seem like it will continue on, right? And you can say, well, the reason why I say it continue on is because there's a pattern of human figures, and it seems like that pattern will continue, right? And that would be a correct assumption. Another correct assumption for this would be that the line stops right there, right? Either or is a correct assumption, because that's what the possibilities are within the facts of this artwork. What other ways can you describe this line, right? I think what else. I think we pretty much got it. But how is it being used? It's being used to create direction, as we mentioned. It's being used to create a sense of um, horizon of sort. It's being used to create a surface for the speakers to walk on, and so forth and so on. Right? That's how the line is. All right, let's move on forward. Let's look at another different kind of artwork. Right, so this one is a great piece of art by Sandbach, and Sandbach's artworks are pretty interesting. Now, one of the sad things about me showing you this image on the screen and not being able to be in a gallery in a museum looking at this artwork is that the perception of artwork, the experience of artwork allows you to see and experience the objects in a completely different way. Now, I say that because if you were in this space at this point, right, if you were inside the gallery or the museum, these objects, even though they're just outlines, will seem like they were solid, right? So instead of just being this little tiny thin lines of thread, which is what it's made out of, you would think that there is a piece of glass, right? And there would be all kinds of pieces of glass. Anyways, so back to describing the line, back to describing how the line is being used. So in this case, let's describe the line and the artwork. So we have an artwork made by lines that are intersecting. Now the lines are straight lines, right? Some vertical, some horizontal. That stop at vertices to create, rectangles. You can say a pattern of 4 rectangles, 1, 2, 4, and then 1 large square on the back or on the front. Right. Now, what is line doing in this case? Well, line is creating space. Right? It's creating a space in here. It's also creating an outline. Right? It's creating a sense of volume. This room, right? And I don't think what else would line be doing in this case. I can't think of anything right now, but you can definitely describe and use what we just talked about, or talk about how line is being used. Let's move forward. We can talk about line quality. So quality is the visual appearance of a line, except for direction. So line quality can convey mood, emotions, those kind of things. So a line can be, for example, happy, right, or angry, and you can definitely get those emotions by looking at a line. And for example, if a kid is drawing, for example, right, little clouds like that versus something like this, even though these are just lines, right, one seems to have an emotion or a mood that conveys happiness or stress-free, while the other one's more angry. The lines are not doing that. It's our perception of those. We can always convey the mood using the correct lines, right? So you can also convey heaviness or lightness. Right, so you can say that this line is lighter than the ones at the bottom. Right, so this line right here is lighter than the ones at the bottom, and so forth and so on. Okay. Hopefully you guys have any questions about line. It's pretty simple. Line, like I said, has the most flexibility of all the elements of art, and most artworks out there have line one way or another. You just have to kind of learn how to describe and find it. All right, the next one, shape or form. So what's the difference between a shape and a form? Shape is normally characterized by a flat dimensional form or shape. The form actually comes out and it becomes visually 3-dimensional. So in this case, for example, these are shapes. These are all shapes. And shapes do you see? Triangles. We see a red one, we see a gray one. We see a zigzag, and we see, you can even say maybe an implied square, a green one, right? So all those are shapes. There's no forms here. There's no intent to show 3-dimensionality with this artwork. That's Frank Stella. I apologize. Like I said, form, on the other hand, gives us a sense of 3 dimensions. Now, once you have three-dimensionality, then you have to discuss about positive negative space, right? As well as figure-ground relationships. One of the greatest artists to talk about this kind of differentiation between shapes and form is going to be N.C. Escher. So you guys might have seen N.C. Escher before. This one's Sky and Water. It's a wonderful way to know the difference. So here at the very center, right here, we have very flat shapes, right? So we have the shape of a fish and the shape of a bird. The moment that N.C. Escher starts adding information to the same drawings to where this bird becomes much more three-dimensional, right? Where we have a sense of three-dimensionality or a sense of depth, all of a sudden they're not longer the shapes of fish and birds. Now we have forms of birds. This is the form of a bird. This is the form of a fish. Here, because they're two-dimensional, they're still shapes. Hopefully you're seeing the difference. Now, once we go into the area where we have forms, now we have a positive and a negative space. The positive space would be, in this case, our bird, and the negative space would be this area in between, the thing that seems to be the background. And because we are talking about a painting, something that's flat, right? Then we're also talking about a figure-ground relationship. And also talk about figure-ground relationship with a photograph. It's still flat, but then you have a figure and a ground to discuss. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, to reiterate right here with the bottom part, we have the shape of a fish, slowly turning into the form of a fish. Once we have the form of a fish itself is a positive space, and the other, the black, the negative, right? And then here we have figure-ground relationship. Okay, I think I explained that one through. However, this one can be confusing, and it happens to me a lot of times where I can confuse shape and form, and sometimes I have to stop and think, okay, which one's which. So don't feel bad if you do, if you confuse them, but nevertheless know the difference. That one does require a figure ground, or that it's three-dimensional aspect, while the other one's a flat aspect. All right, the next one is value. This one's interesting because when I taught at high school, to me, students were having a hard time understanding value. Most of them thought that it was shading. Shading and value is not the same thing. Shading is the way in which you apply value to an artwork or an image or something, but it's not the same thing as value. Value is just a transition between dark and light. Right? That's just it. It's just a transition between dark and light. So if we were in the I would find a shadow in the room. So I'm looking at the screen right now, and I'm looking, and I can see one here behind my sculpture, right? So in here, right here behind the sculpture, if you notice, there is a shadow, right? So the wall's not painted, right? But there it goes very dark right here, and then it goes lighter, and then it goes into the lighter side where there's no shadow. Well, that is value. Value is just that transition between dark and light. Okay. At any point whatsoever have I taken a crayon or a pencil or charcoal or anything and drawn that in, right? That would be shading. But I don't need to do shading in order to create value. The value is already there. And it's just that, the transition between darks and lights. And you can see value right there. We can see value changing right in blue. You see values right there on the wall. All of those things are value, and none of them were drawn. So hopefully I made the point across. All right, back to here. Right. Excellent. So let's talk about value and the surfaces. Also, we can have value with color. So we have a darker and a lighter value. But you have to understand that when we're talking about values, the reason why we want to make sure, or not make sure, but that we use values in art is because values and strong use of values can help us with contrast, right? Now, you can purposefully create an artwork with very little value changes. That would be purposeful. But most of the time, Artworks that tend to be visually interesting tend to have a lot of contrast. And why is that? Well, because our eyes are um, biologically drawn to contrast. We can see better when there's strong contrast. Um, how can I explain this? So, for example, we if everything was exactly the same value system, right, the same kind of gray, or the same kind of white, the same kind of black, we wouldn't be able to see, right? So our eyes are constantly looking for value changes. And how does that work? Actually, it's pretty simple. Have you ever been in a room that has no windows and somebody has to turn off the lights, right? Or something in that matter? As the objects inside the room is still there, chairs or the tables or whatever, they're still there, right? Do they still have color? They are still have color. However, you cannot see them, right? Why can't you see them? Because there's no value changes. There's not a light there that creates a sense of value on the objects in the room for you to be able to see them. So that's why value is so important, and that's why artists, when they want something to be very clean, precise, sharp, then we have very strong values. That way, the eye can clearly understand and see the difference between some objects and the other. Now, when you do create value system on a painting or a art, it also gives us a direction, a sense of the direction of the light, right? So if there's lighter values in one side, then we know that the light's coming in that direction, and you have dark values on the other side. So it gives us a sense of the three-dimensional world because of a sense of light and how the light kind of moves across the surface. Another thing that artworks you can do with artworks in regards to value is that when you exaggerate the value system, when you push the darks or the lights in a composition, then you can create very dramatic um, lighting, very lighting that focuses the viewer's attention in one specific spot, or gives a sense of enigma, right? So drama in general. So when you do that and you push the darker values, the lighter values to the end or to a very sharp contrast, we call that chiaroscuro. So chiaroscuro, which is the very bottom of the screen, is the light or dark technique that uses strong contrast to create drama and helps define these dimensional objects in space. Now, if you ever take a film class, you're also going to hear chiaroscuro when applied to movies like um, older movies by Hitchcock, and his use of chiaroscuro lighting, and where there's a lot of dark shadows used in the film in order to kind of hide or create a sense of drama. Here's a beautiful example of a chiaroscuro artwork, and this is from the Baroque period. I have here Saint Jerome, and this is by Caravaggio, who in this time period, this kind of contrast and chiaroscuro type of paintings were very much part of the art making of that period. Now, one of the funny things I always find is that, culturally people see this kind of artworks and talk about how natural these things looks, how close to reality this is, and that's why this is a good piece of artwork. And the funny things is that if you start applying, say, logic to this painting, you're going to recognize that this is actually being manipulated quite a bit. The artist is manipulating what you see in the artwork in the painting very much. Because let's say, for example, what kind of light sources would Saint Jerome have in order to work at night? It would be a candle, right? So hopefully everybody has worked or has been around a candle at night and have paid attention how the candle basically um, highlights everything in the room, right, with very strong shadows nevertheless. However, everything in the room tends to be baked by the same amount of color, of that yellowish color, right? So it's not like this painting right here. This painting seems to be lit by a kind of sharp uh, pool of light, something like a handheld large uh, light would be, right? Actually, one that's more contemporary than anything else. So the reality or the natural representation of this is not from reality, right? Reality here has been changed in order for us to pay attention to the actions of Saint Jerome reading and also to the scroll and the book, right? So in this case, values have been manipulated into a chiaroscuro format in order for us to kind of view those two things, right? So far away from reality. It's very well rendered. We can recognize the figure very well as an Uncle Gentleman, but definitely not very naturalistic or real. Very naturalistic, but not reality. Okay. All right, so that was value. Next one is color. Color. Okay. Color is going to take a little bit of time to explain, and that's because I'm going to plug in here in the next 5 minutes what I would normally talk about in the full semester, 2 semesters of color theory, right? So I'm going to go through quite a bit of information. I'm going to compact it into just a bit of stuff. Now, if you've had classical art or art in from middle school up to this point, you've probably seen color theory. So this is going to be redundant, and actually, some of the other elements of art are going to be pretty redundant to you. But hopefully, I'm giving you some additional information beyond what you've learned from high school. So let's talk about color. The very first thing about color theory that we need to know is the color wheel. Hopefully, most of you have seen the color wheel before, but basically, the color wheel is a visual representation of the way colors relate to one another. That's basically it. So we're going to have, warm colors on one side, cool colors on the other side, and warm colors are on this side and cool colors on the other one. And then we're going to have, darker values on the outside and cooler on the or lighter in the inside, or vice versa. Nevertheless, that's basically what a color wheel is. So as we continue to move to this understanding the color wheel, the very first thing we need to know is what are primary colors. So primary colors are colors that cannot be created by mixing any color together, but it can generate all others. So that's what primary colors are. And you have 3 of them. That's yellow, blue, and red. And they're placed inside the color wheel in 3 kind of opposite parts of the color wheel. Now, when you mix 2 equal amounts of color of the blue and the yellow, then now you have a secondary color. And a secondary color is when you mix 2 primary colors together, right? And that's when you get green, for example, when you mix yellow and blue, violet when you mix blue and red, and then you have red and yellow, which is orange, right? Now, purple, violet, tomato. We normally use violet in art, but either or is fine. One of the things that's really interesting is that, as I mentioned before, if I was teaching color theory in a classroom, right, and we were actually doing painting in a classroom, truly understanding what color looks like, or the pigments look like, then I would have you, have droplets, right? And I have you drop like 3 droplets of yellow and 3 droplets of blue and mix that specific amount and then paint with that, right? That way you know exactly what green looks like an exact amount of yellow and exact amount. And that would take a little while for you to do. So that's why, we'd spend a whole day talking about primary colors and a whole day talking about secondary colors and so on. Now, tertiary colors. Oh, sorry. This is where you place secondary colors in the color wheel, right? So we have them in between the primary colors. Here's orange between yellow and red, green between blue and yellow, and then violet or purple, red. All right, so tertiary colors. Tertiary colors is when we add more of the primary color to that secondary colors. Colors in the color wheel can be created by mixing the secondary color with the primary color mixed. In this case, it's when we're going to get red orange, red violet, violet, blue green. One thing to keep in mind about tertiary colors is that their names work like a first and last name, right? So your primary color is going to be up front, and then your secondary color is going to be after. That's why it's red orange, not orange red. Okay. That's the easiest way to remember. It's kind of first name, last name type of thing. And they're going to be placed inside in between, right? These areas of the color wheel. There they are. So there's your yellow orange, yellow green, violet, and red orange. Neutral colors are colors that are basically the either black, white, or gray. Or the other neutral color you can create is when you take equal amount of yellow, blue, and red and mix them together. Now, if you ever done that before, if you take yellow, blue, and red, it creates a very awkward-looking green. Actually, similar to the one that's right here on the edge. That's basically kind of the color that you get. Now, when you add white to this color right here, you get beige. Right? You get kind of a light skin color type of color, right? You get beige. And that's why we call beige a neutral color, because it's based on that yellow, blue, and red combination. Other than that, in other, you will have gray, black, and white as I mentioned. A hue is a color in its purest of forms, right? So in some cases, you have a very bright, brilliant color, and let's say you wanted to mix it together. Let's say it's a bright, beautiful green, right? And then you have all the yellows, blues together. You really have to mix, create that one green. That's probably because the one green that you want to replicate is a hue. It's in its most purest of form. And those hue a lot of times come from different pigments, right? Rather than from the combination of pigments, it's from one specific pigment. So that's a hue. Now, every year there is a Pantone color, right? So, and Pantone colors are based on basically hues. There's other ways of serializing or categorizing, sorry, colors, but Pantone is one of the main ones. And this blue was from 2019. And every year they pick one. Actually, it's 2020? Yeah, 20. Actually, I don't remember. I need to double check because I think it's either last year's or 2020. Okay, like I mentioned before, you can also apply value to a color. And when you apply value to a color, when you add white to that one color, we call it a tint. So this is a tint of blue of the same kind of hue that we have here. Or if you add black, then we call that a shade. Right? So we have different values. And as we lighten the value of a color, we call that a tint. And if we go darker with the values, we call that a shade. And of course, the one in the middle will be your hue. When we're talking about actual compositions and painting with all the colors, if you choose or the artist chooses to create an artwork that only relies on one small set of color, right? So let's say just blue or just red or green or whatever color, plus all its values, all the tints and the shades, we call that a monochromatic painting. So monochromatic color schemes have only one color and all its values. Here's a great example of a painting with halo, right? And if you notice, everything in this painting has the tonality of blue. Right? Even the skin tone seems to be a little bit blue. So we would call this painting a monochromatic. This specific painting is part of the Kimball Art Museum's collection. So if you go to the Kimball, you'll get to see this painting in person. All right. One of the things about color theory is that you can also have complementary colors. There's two types of complementary colors out there, actually three different types, but we're going to talk about two. The first one is going to be regular complementary colors, which are opposite to one another in the color wheel. So for example, yellow and purple, or green and red, orange and blue. And those are the strongest contrasts they are. And you're going to see the use of this contrasting colors a lot when it comes down to um, logo making, or things of that nature. Why? Because of what I said before. The stronger the contrast, the more intentional it is for people to be attracted to. Okay, so for example, how many logos or just yeah logos do you know are orange and purple, right? LSU, and you have the Lakers, for example, or another very kind of very well known contrast, red and green. That's are the colors that we use for driving signs or for Christmas, for the matter of fact, as well. So that exists quite a bit in the world, especially when it comes down to marketing. Very, very important. Another one that is complement of color is what we call our a split complementary. And a split complementary is when you have this yellow, red, and blue together, or the orange, green, and violet together into the same composition. So they're very much opposite from one another, so they create very strong contrast. So things like McDonald's uses kind of that split complementary type of colors, and many other logos. Here's a painter. You guys probably recognize the style of this specific painter. You can also probably read his signature here. This is Vincent van Gogh, and you can definitely clearly see here the use of complementary colors for this composition. We have the red and the derivatives of the red, maybe there's some red oranges and so on. And then we have the complementary color, which is going to be the green, as well as the yellow, green, and other derivatives of the same, right? Now, one of the cool things about Van Gogh, let me see if I have that now. One of the cool things about Van Gogh, and we'll talk about Van Gogh later, is that Van Gogh used color very arbitrarily. He did not follow the natural representation of color as we see it in nature. What he understood is that we experience artwork, right, through our eyes. And as I mentioned before, our eyes like certain kinds of contrast in order for us to recognize the world, right? So he used color not only expressionistically, meaning to discuss his own feelings, but also as a way to use the color as a way of applying contrast and value without really using a lot of black in his paintings, right? So if you notice in this case, there's a very minimal amount of use of black to create values. Instead, what he does is he uses the complementary colors, right, to create a sensation of value change, or even the feeling of an edge on a chair, for example. So by adding green where there's red, then you can have an edge without having black. So very, very interesting use of complementary colors to create compositions. Right. The next set of colors is going to be analogous colors. Analogous colors are colors that are right next to each other on a color wheel, right? They're right next to each other. These subcombinations tend to have very little contrast. So it's the opposite of what we're just talking about. Now, when you do this, instead of having something that's visually very active, then it's the opposite. It's going to have something that's visually very calm, right? Because it has very little contrast. Here's a beautiful example of a painting that has analogous colors. We have blue, greens, and all the way up to possibly, here's the yellow, orange, just a little bit for a little bit of pop of color in here. But nevertheless, most of the composition here by Renoir is going to be fairly analogous, right? Very calm. It's not as vibrant as the one that we just saw by Van Gogh. Cool colors, as I mentioned when we were just talking about, when we first started talking about the color wheel, are basically half of the color wheel, and that half contains the colors that we normally associate with coolness, right? So that would be what we talked about, on the other PowerPoint regarding an index, right? So our index of cool, it can be expressed by cool colors, right? So greens and blues and purples and things like that. And that's referential to our own personal experience, obviously, to the night and to water and to ice. Here's a beautiful drawing. It's by Degas, using basically cool colors in order to create this composition. Now, I absolutely love this painting because, or this drawing, this is it's actually not charcoal, it's a pastel drawing. And one of the interesting things about this drawing is that it looks like it was drawn with uh, sensitive glasses, right? Where you're able to see where the warmth color, where the warmth is, and where the coolness is not, is. Um, in a time period where those glasses did not exist, right? So the artist was able to visualize warmth, right, in areas where it would be more warm, and then areas where things were more cool. So really, really, really interesting use of cool colors in this case. And obviously, the opposite would be warm colors. That's where you're going to have colors that have index of heat or warmth, right? Things that reminds us biologically of the sun, of fire, and so forth and so on. So there's going to be red, oranges, all the way up to yellows. And here's a great example of a painting that uses that index of warmth, the warm colors, in order to convey a scene from heat. And this is going to be Gauguin, okay? Or Gauguin from Tahiti. We'll talk about Gauguin later. He was very good friends with Van Gogh. He was half Peruvian. Anyway, we'll talk about him later. But anyways, here and hopefully feel through an index, the warmth of the sand, the warmth of the sun of Tahiti or the islands, by the overall kind of yellow cast that the full painting has, the water. Okay, everybody good with color? Yes, we're basically halfway there. All right, next one is texture. Texture is just the surface characteristic of an object. Right? Now, we have to be careful when we're talking about texture because there's two possible ways that we can understand texture. Now, make sure that when you are writing in your exams about texture, that you're using texture words, right? Describe the texture. Do not just talk about texture and not describe the texture. You have to say texture words like hard, soft, bumpy, smooth, sharp, furry. Those kind of words need to be used in order to describe texture. So make sure you're doing that. Now, what I was talking about earlier is this issue with texture. Texture in art can either be actual texture or it can be implied texture, right? So what do I mean by that? If you're looking at this images in front of you, right, we have the two boots, right, and then we have this purse or this bag. Which one of those two artworks is made out of ceramics or clay, right? And which one's made out of leather, right? So some of you automatically thought, oh, the boots are made of leather, right? So you would be wrong. Yeah, boots are made out of clay, out of ceramics. So in this case, we have this implied texture of leather, right? Here we have actual texture of leather. So in order to continue on with this conversation, let's talk about the three different kinds of way that artists show texture in their artwork. The first one, just like I just mentioned, is called natural texture or actual texture. It allows the texture of the original material to remain and retain all its characteristics. So there's no change on the actual material. It is what it is when you see it. So here's a great example of actual texture. And this is a very well-known piece of artwork by Merritt Oppenheim. And this comes with a little bit of a myth story. So we have Merritt Oppenheim in Paris having a kind of a brunch or coffee with some other contemporary artists of his time. I don't remember which one they are. It could be Matisse, could be, Renoir, one of those. Basically top contemporaries at first. They're sitting down at the table, and it's a fairly chilly day, and the waiter, they're bringing out the coffee, and conversation somehow came about, how it would be cool to have some kind of coat for the coffee pot or for the coffee cup for it to stay warm. And her surrealism mind kind of pictured this cup with fur on it, right? And anyway, so they finished the coffee, whatever else, and so she went out and bought herself some material and created this piece of artwork that is fairly well known. It's a very well known surreal piece of artwork, right? So it's a cup and saucer that is meant to keep your coffee, your drink warm just because he has a cup, right? Kind of interesting. Anyways, I mentioned this because this is actual texture, it's natural texture. The texture of the fur has not changed. She has not manipulated it all and cut it to fit the object. But nevertheless, the fur is still fur, right? She hasn't painted the fur. She hasn't really like carved any kind of pattern on it to make it seem like it was part of the plates. None of those things. She left the texture of the fur as it was. So that is natural texture. Right? So whenever you guys go to New York City, you go to the MoMA, they have the actual piece at the MoMA. You'll see Oppenheim's work. All right, the next one is what we call work texture. Work texture is when you manipulate the surface to create a new texture to the outside. So whether you take a piece of wood and you carve it, or you polish it, or you grind it, or metal, or whatever, the moment you change the natural characteristics of that material, then all of a sudden you no longer have natural texture. Now you have work. You have added something that's foreign to that material. Here we have a great example of that. Now, this specific artwork is made out of rubber tires, and the artwork is massive, it's really long. So it's about 10 foot wide and then about 3 foot tall. So it's pretty big, but nevertheless, it's tires. In here, the texture of the tires have been completely changed, right? So it's smooth, and then cut, and so forth. This, guys, for example, is an example of a non-representational piece of artwork. So there is nothing representational there. The only thing that you're seeing there is material, texture, period, nothing else. There's, of course, meaning behind it, but then you would have to read about, what Buka was talking about in regards to this body of work. All right, and the last one is the one that we discussed regarding the boots, right? Made out of ceramics. So implied texture is when you take a material and completely change it to be referential to another material or texture, right? To me, it's funny that we think that artwork that is able to change materials to read something else are better than other artworks with the materials left alone, right? So if for any reason the artisan or the artist or the person's able to manipulate a piece of wood to make it look like, I know, a bird or whatever because it looks like feathers, then all of a sudden that's good artwork, right? Same thing with clay or ceramics. We tend to have this kind of awe to that manipulation of the material. And you know what? To me, I'm very sad about the material of clay and wood at the same time. I feel kind of sad about it because nobody really appreciates wood for the sake of wood. You only get to appreciate wood in an artistic manner if it's converted to be something completely else other than wood, right? Very seldomly do we actually stop and look at the beauty of a piece of wood for what it is, right? And experience it and experience the beauty of it. The same thing with clay, right? So clay is exactly the same thing. Clay as a material is very interesting, but people don't appreciate it for clay. They appreciate it that it's manipulated to look like something completely else other than clay itself, right? So sometimes you're going to go to a museum or a gallery, and people who are really intrigued about the beauty of the material, for material's sake of art, right? Just the material for how beautiful it is. you're going to see objects that are like just clumps of clay, right, that have been fired. They don't look like anything else. They're just clumps of clay. Well, those kind of objects will be non-representational piece of artwork, and they're not referential to anything in nature, but they're referencing the beauty of the clay as a material, as an object, right? So we would have to stop and look at that the material itself and find things that the artist is trying to show you on the beauty of that material or that object, right? There's some really interesting objects out there where have this huge chunk of clay in which the artist, puts themselves into the clay and drags and even bites into the clay, right? And then slowly releases themselves out of that and then lets it dry and then fire. Well, some people might find that silly. However, there's something beautiful about clay where clay allows us to print the most exquisite detail into the material itself, and it allows us to fire it and then let it last for millennia if we want it. Right? One of the most strongest of materials out there. That to me is extremely beautiful about ceramics, about clay, right? A cup made out of clay is also beautiful, but the material itself lose the beauty of what the material is because of the object that it was created, right? So keep that in mind when you're looking at a museum or a gallery and you see just a chunk of clay or wood or metal or any other material that's just left in the gallery as the material itself, almost untouched, because there's a reason behind it about the beauty of that material. All right, that's one. So here we go again. We have a painting by Van Gogh, another painting by Van Gogh. Everybody probably recognizes Starry Night. Starry Night, if we were to discuss about the texture of it, right? What kind of textures do you see, right? And you have to be very mindful of what you're going to say. Why? Because if you say, "Oh no, you have the textures of the plant and you have the textures of all of these things," you're probably actually wrong. Everything that you see in a two-dimensional painting or in a painting or a two-dimensional piece of artwork is going to be implied, right? So if you have, let's say, feathers, or if you have, like in this case, a tree, the information here of the roughness of the tree or the feathers on something or the fur on something is completely implied, right? And the reason why I say that is because the actual texture of this painting would be very bumpy, right? Imagine I was able to take my hand and put it across the painting and I would feel the actual texture of the painting. It would be bumpy, right? It wouldn't, or in the other case, it would be smooth or semi-smooth or whatever else. That would be the actual texture of that painting. Everything else within the painting, right, is going to be an implied texture. I took this picture when I went to the MoMA, which is where Starry Night is located at. And the reason why I took this picture specifically for these classes is because I wanted you to see the texture of the painting. So this would be the actual texture of the painting. And as I mentioned before, you can actually see it. And if you were able to take your hand through it, it would be very bumpy. Here's another picture of the same. Hopefully it gives you an idea of the dimensions, right? It's about 2.5 inches thick. So it's not a very large painting. But nevertheless, it's Starry Night by Van Gogh. All right, let's talk about space. Space is the actual three-dimensional field that a piece of work occupies. Now we're talking about it virtually or actually, right? Virtually is because we're talking about paintings where we have a flat reality. So the objects in there work within a virtual world, or we can see it, recognize them through the virtual world, or real, like a sculpture, right? We're going to start talking about three-dimensional artwork first, and then we'll go into three-dimensional art. So with three-dimensional art, as I mentioned before, with a form, we have positive and negative space. Same thing with a sculpture, right? So positive space is the part of the artwork that physically occupies the space. That would be positive space. Here we have clouds, sky cloud gate, right? Or what is called the beam in Chicago, right? It's another one of those voids that we talked about, right? Hopefully you guys starting to recognize his work. And in that case, sorry, we have the positive space, which would be the cloud gate or the beam, and then the negative space would be around it. And the negative space is all the unfilled spaces that is activated by the work. This is very important. This word activated is very important. And I'll mention that in a minute. So here we have star by art. We have the star itself, this part right here is going to be your positive space, and then your negative space will be obviously this hole right here and the area around it. Okay, but then you're thinking, well, Mr. V, how far out? How far out of the space do you recognize the negative space? Well, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Before we talk about that, I want to talk about this specific artwork. This is also by Borowski. Right? This looks, male and female. And how would you describe this artwork? So we talk about, would this be a form or would this be a shape? Right? So you see how it lacks the characteristics of three-dimensionality. Even though it is a sculpture and it has thickness, it is not really representing three-dimensionality. So in this case, would be the shape of a man, right? Figure of a man. So it's the outline of a male figure. Now, out of this one, we have a negative space, right, of a female figure, about a third of the size of the male figure within its torso. What other things can you say about the sculpture? You can probably talk about the material. You can talk about how tall it is, and a few other things. Now, conceptually speaking, right, probably some of you are going to be a little bit uncomfortable looking at this work, especially if you happen to be female, possibly because there's, here we have a female figure that is the third size of a male figure. Why are they equal? Disparities between one or the other. You can also bring it from a religious point of view and say, oh, the man was created from, female, sorry, was created from the rib from the male, and so forth and so on. Or you can also discuss about, behind every great man is a great woman, the love of his life. I mean, just all kinds of different things. Probably just by looking at it, get a conceptual idea of what it could be. Now, I'd like to show this one right here because you guys should be familiar with this artist who uses, in this case, in this body of work, negative spaces and positive spaces to convey some of his work and images. Hopefully, you've seen this work before. This is here in Fort Worth, one of our most precious pieces of artwork out there, and this is the Working Men. Oh, sorry, Men with Briefcase, my apologies. So Men with Briefcase, it's a negative cutout or negative space out of this piece of metal, basically. And obviously, we have here a male figure, or the outline of a male figure, I should say, that's possibly wearing a hat, looks like he's wearing a hat, and is carrying a briefcase, especially with the label of it. Now, given that we've seen this artwork, and also the one with the line, right, with the people walking up the line. And hopefully you guys remember that artwork. Right here, right? So in this case, right there, this is all by the same artist right here. If you notice, they seem to be, there's another one with a briefcase, right? What would they be doing that, that morning, or what are they doing all together? It seems like they're going to work. Now, I mentioned all of those things together because when you are looking at when you're looking at artwork, right, and get those presumptions about what this artwork could be, the easiest way to see if you're correct about the meaning of an artwork is by looking at other pieces of artwork by the same artist or reading about what the intent is of the artist and getting to know that artist or the artwork better. Because if you're basically describing this through lenses of religion or the other possible ways, then you probably are going down the wrong rabbit hole. If you look at the other work, the one with the briefcase and the other one with the line where people are going to work, then you realize that his artwork is much more of a commentary about business world than it is, right? So in this case, there's a discussion done on a business related manner, basically, right? Possibly inequalities of pay, inequalities of work, availability, those kind of things are the things that this artwork is much more likely representing than anything related to religion or personal relationships, etc. So please be mindful when you're judging or describing the meaning of an artwork solely based on your own experiences or solely based on your bias before rather than looking at the fact of the artwork and the information related to it, or the artist, for the matter of fact, or the body of work of the artist. So here's activated space. So this is what I was talking about. When you have positive and negative space, right? How far out do you expect that activation of space to happen? So activation of space is this kind of how can I explain it? Let me change the screen again. Everybody has a personal bubble, right? This distance, the space that we recognize ourselves to kind of be our own personal space. But there's no bubble, right? There's no line. It's not a defined area, right? But nevertheless, there's a feeling attached to it. There's a relationship that comes with it. So activated space with a sculpture is very much like that. So the activation space of an artwork is kind of like its bubble as well. Is how much space do you recognize that that artwork occupies within that area that is not the physical. And you guys have had that experience before, especially when you're doing some kind of interior design at your houses. Let's say you put a painting on a wall, right? And then you step back and you say, it needs something else. Well, that's because the activation of space of that specific artwork is not as much, right, as other ones. And sometimes you can have a really bright, small artwork that you can put in the middle of the wall, and then you can actually hold that wall or feel like it fits in that wall. And that's because the activation of space of that specific piece of artwork is much larger. So that's what it means by activated space, kind of that unseen bubble where the artwork seems to exist, or the perceived area, spatial presence, an object occupies beyond it. Let's look at a couple of examples. This is activation of space in a very large manner. Okay. In this case, we have Christo and Jean Claude, and unfortunately, Christo passed away earlier this year. So a big loss for the art world, because this duo of artists created or still creates in some ways this monumental artworks. So let's go back to activation of space. So if we're talking about the activation of space, if you see this object here, right, this umbrella, and then you see the other umbrella, you automatically create a relationship between the two of them. You know that they're both related because they're identical objects, right? So if you were to stand up in the middle of both of them, then you feel like you are in between the artwork, right? And if you continue to see down the coast, right, and down the street, down the roadway, you'll see all of these little umbrellas. So anywhere in here, you're going to feel like you're part of the artwork. That's part of the activation of space of all of those objects together for that installation. Now, the cool thing about this installation that it did is that in Japan, at the same time, down the coast, they had similar umbrellas, this one for blue instead, right, in that coast. So if you were in a plane or if you were in a boat somewhere in the Pacific Ocean between Japan and California, and you knew that those objects existed on both sides, the activation of space in this case will be basically hemispherical. It will be kind of half of the whole hemisphere, and you'll be able to kind of quote unquote experience being part of the artwork because you know the existence of those objects. So pretty interesting, pretty cool. Now, the opposite exists with participatory artwork. Participatory artwork is when the object kind of wants you to get closer to it. You know, it's an experience that requires you to get close and experience the space a lot more tight than the other one. Right? So in this case, we have this beautiful object by Otornes, which is a very small sculpture in the very corner of this bench. And you know, in order to experience it, it's better to get kind of crouch in front of it and look at it, or really close to it and experience it, rather than like one of Jean Claude's installations where it's the opposite, right? So here's the two opposites. You have activation space, and then you have participatory space. And as I was mentioning, installations. What is an installation? So an installation is artworks that are completely based on space. They are often either site specific, meaning that they're meant to exist in one space only, and they're meant to transform or the actual space or the perception of the space. So in some cases, you'll have objects that are attached to the buildings or to the rooms or to, area, or sometimes objects are brought into space in such a way that it manipulates and changes the way the space is. So this, for example, is an installation. And I myself like to do installations. I like to work together inside of a space to change the perception of a space, to change it into something else, right? So changing a gallery into a church, or a gallery into a classroom, or a gallery into a burial site, or so forth and so on. That is an installation. In this case, we have an installation by Ai Weiwei. It's called Bang. It's got obviously tons of stools, wooden stools, and there's a whole bunch of meaning behind this specific installation, which I'm not going to go down. I'm not going to talk about it, but nevertheless, you can experience how the space is being divided by all these objects, and it's a different space than if it was an empty, cavernous room. Now, with two-dimensional space, you have to understand that everything in that surface, anything that it feels like there's space in there, is completely an illusion. The space in there, it's not real. It's all 100% an illusion, right? So that's one of the things that you always have to think and keep in mind. Okay. Now, the area which that world, quote unquote, exists is what we call the picture plane, right? It's the edges that defines the painting or the object, right? That is the picture plane. So in order to create that illusion of space, there's several different ways you can do it. The most basic way to create an illusion of space is by organizing the shapes within the composition. Now, in this case, we're looking at this composition of the Egyptian mural. What objects would you think you would experience first? Let's say, which ones are in front of you, and then which ones go slightly further and then further and further. Well, hopefully for most of you, the front at the bottom seem to be the ones up front. And as things go higher and higher into space here, or into the image, I should say, then they should feel further and further into space. Even though everything's flat, we feel that this object's down here closer to us than the ones in the background or on the top. Right? So, what are some basic ways to create that sense of space through or illusion of space on a flat surface? The most simplistic way is to do vertical placement, which is what the Egyptians did. The one that's closest to you at the bottom, and then the closest, the one that's furthest up, furthest out, up. The next way you can create a slightly much more wider sense of depth, or a still with the shallow depth of field, it's going to be by taking the objects and then overlapping one on top of the other. And the third way is going to be by overlapping, but also diminishing the space. This is the next way to create kind of even a much more implied sense of space within that picture plane. And last but not least, if we take the overlapping, we do it vertically, and then we diminish the size, we can definitely get a much better feel for that sense of space. Here's a great example by Cezanne. Right, so the same thing here, right? So basically what we're just seeing. Now we don't need a very deep sense of space in this specific, composition, just because obviously it's on top of the table, so that works quite well. Now, when it comes to two-dimensional space and perspective, perspective is that illusion that we were just talking about, right? It's a sense that there is a back or an emptiness behind in a flat surface, right? And this linear perspective, specific linear perspective, where we're using lines to create a sense of depth of field, was invented, or basically invented by the architect Brunelleschi. Okay, and this is 1413. Now, 1413, in a matter of art, human history, that's like yesterday. It was not that long ago. That's about 600, 700 years ago. And for us, technologically, we've done so much after linear perspective was being utilized properly in creating new technologies and things like that, and to also create some really interesting pieces of artwork. So the linear perspective is based on the illusion that is created, visual illusion that is created for us, the way we experience the world, where two parallel lines seem to convert at the end or on the horizon, right? As it goes further and further into space. That is linear perspective. So Brunelleschi, what he did is basically, instead of he recreated that illusion on the canvas or on paper, and this is what it looks like. So when you have the lines ending in one single point in space, we call it one-point perspective. When we have it more than one spot, then we have it a two-point perspective. And there's also a three-point perspective, which can be done through kind of the bird's eye view type of thing, or from bottom up as well. Now, I kind of like to show this a little bit because a lot of people think that when you have an art career, you cannot make money with the art career. That it's a career that is not very lucrative. And I like to showcase that that's not the case. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that right now with perspective is because some of you might have done perspective in high school, some of your classes, or if you're taking some of the art classes in college, you've also done one-point perspective or perspective drawings in general, right? And it can be tedious, and sometimes you think, well, why am I needing this, or why would I use it? Or if you're an artist, how can I make money with it? Well, I've been very lucky because in the past, because of the skill and an understanding one-point perspective, I was able to participate for 2 seasons in the show Donna Decorates Dallas, right? So this is, I did all the drawings for the show. She is showing the drawing in camera. This is the actual room that was designed. And anyways, here's the actual drawing. And all of this drawing right here was done with one-point perspective. Same thing as right here, doing exactly the same stuff. So, the art world can be extremely lucrative. You can make a lot of money knowing how to utilize the elements of art and the principles of design and create things using those skills. Make money using those skills. All right, there we go. One-point perspective in history. During the Renaissance is the time period where it is being highly utilized. It was kind of rediscovered, and this is a painting by by Raphael. And in the School of Athens here, this is not Jesus or St. Peter. This is, two of the greatest thinkers on earth. So from Greek times. So we have Aristotle and Socrates, I believe. Anyways, and we have this painting here made with 1 point perspective. So you can see that all the lines, the vertical lines, go back into space, right? Match the center of the composition, right? Right to where basically we want our eyes to be right here. So very, very simple composition, but nevertheless using 1 point perspective to draw our eyes right to the center, to the focal point. Great emphasis right there. Okay. The other kind of perspective or illusion of space on a canvas or a painting or a flat surface is going to be atmospheric perspective, or what we call aerial perspective. So the aerial perspective is when you don't have lines, basically. Say we are doing a landscape, right? So you don't have lines. So in order to create a sense of depth, then you can do this. You have aerial or atmospheric perspective. And the way it works is the objects that's in front of you are much sharper than the things that go back further into space. So here is a great example of that as well, right? A simplified example. And here we have an actual example of a piece of artwork. This is by Senju. And here in the front, we have very kind of detailed elements, right? And as things go further and further into space, they lose detail. They're much less sharp, right? So it gives a sense of aerial perspective, and this is aerial perspective. Now, with a Western example of it, we have Burn, and the same thing here, right? So as objects go further and further into space, they become less and less and less detailed, right? So here we have the mountain, which is basically just patch color. Now, I find it kind of funny because, you know, they were like every single area of the surface of this canvas seems to kind of some kind of detail, and it seemed like he was just worried that this was too flat, so he added kind of that one word right there, which is funny. Anyways, that's aerial perspective. That is that illusion that we can create on canvas by slowly diminishing the detail of subjects. Okay. Mass, very much similar to mass in physics, you know, as the bulk of a solid object, right? Now you have to understand that because we're talking about art, sometimes there's actual mass and sometimes implied mass, right? In this case, we kind of have both. In this case, we have an exaggerated mass, actually, but by Fernando Botero. Right, so we have a horse by Fernando Botero, and it's also a massive object, you know, because of its size, but also the material. And then, like I said, he's exaggerated the mass of the animal as well. Now, some people look at his artworks and they call him heavy or fat, but that's not really quite accurate. What Fernando Botero did with his imagery or his artwork is he softened the edges of the figure, of the shapes and the forms. So because they don't lack, because they in some way they lack quote unquote this kind of rigidity, then all of a sudden the forms tend to be much more voluminous. They are able to acquire more weight, right, than usual. So there's much more elasticity to the line with Botero's figures and forms than basically with all the kinds of artwork, or with reality compared to reality, I should say. All right, an implied mass, as I mentioned before, most of the time is going to be in a painting, right? Because a painting, if you were to actually talk about actual mass, the mass of a bunch of paint is going to be very little. However, we can still recognize visually that these objects imply a sense of mass. So all of these objects seem to be heavier, right? Seem to have a bulk to them, but the reality is they're not, right? It's flat. Now, I love to show this one by the Salvador Dali because one of the things that you can do in art is play with our experience of reality, right? And mass is one of the things that we can play with and have fun with. And in this case, he's doing that specifically, right? Where we can see the weight and the mass of these objects on top of those elephants were tends to be massive, being held by this very thin legs. So our logic will tell us that that couldn't happen, right, based on our own experience of mass. So it's really, really interesting. Volume, same thing. It's also very much to our concept of physics. Physics in regards to volume is the total enclosed area occupied by an object. So how much space? And obviously, not everything that covers a lot of space has to be massive as well. Here's a great example of something of that manner, right? So Skipska's artwork here, we have really large glass, long glass threads made large objects, or semi-large objects, but really they're very light, right? They're just made out of glass. Now, the next few elements of art that I'm going to discuss are new elements for most of you. Art teachers, art classes only teach up to volume. So from this point forward, these ones are going to be probably new for you. So let's talk about time. Time is considered basically the fourth dimension. And why is that? Well, because you have the object, right? And then as it changes, in order to experience it, then you have to add more than just height, width, and depth. We're also going to have to stay there and wait for that time period to pass in order for us to experience it. That's why we call it the fourth dimension. Here's a very simple way of experiencing time, right? So we have a painting here where we have St. Anthony and St. Paul, right here at the bottom. But we know that here's St. Anthony walking across this path and then, kind of talking with this metaphor of some sort, and then finally get to this very end, right? So what I'm talking about in time with here, and it's very simplified, is that there's a story being told here, and we, in our mind's eye, we create that time looking at the imagery, right? So there's a time that elapses our information here, here, here. So there is time being used as an element of art in this case. Other written type of paintings that have writing that you can read, of course, going to be comics. In this case, it's a painting of a comic, but nevertheless, it's a comic. One of the things about comics is that you have to spend the time reading the captions. That takes time, right, to understand what the artwork's about. That in general takes time in order to kind of take the artwork in. But also comics, because they're stories, has the ability to manipulate time. So it allows us to, through the writing, to either do flashbacks or forward or future space to the future while you're reading it, and then come back to the present. So it allows us to manipulate time as well when we're talking about comics. And then we get to one of my favorite pieces of artworks out there. Yes, so there's two clocks, and these are kind of literally an artwork about time. And this is the kind of artworks that a lot of people say, well, Mr. V, these are just two clocks that you could have bought in Walmart or in Target and put them side by side, and that's it. Well, yes and no. Okay, that's where concept and art comes into place, right? The reason why this object was being made, the idea, the intent, is what makes this the artwork. So we have two clocks, and they're called Untitled Perfect Lovers. So right off the bat with the title, all of a sudden we probably no longer read clocks, right? So yes, there are two clocks, but when you call them perfect lovers, then all of a sudden we give them a sense, a humanistic sense, right? We give them human particularities to it. So all of a sudden we start seeing them possibly as two people who are in love. And then if they're synchronized, right? If these two clocks are synchronized, which they normally are at the beginning of the installation, right? They're both at the same rhythm. So you can discuss or even think about if they're perfect lovers, how, lives together and it's time and kind of following the rhythm of life together and, the harmony and so forth. Now, The interesting thing about this artwork by Felix is that, whoops, Felix, unfortunately, his partner became ill with HIV complications and passed away. And Felix as well eventually um, died from the same illness. Um, but he made some of the strongest conceptual pieces of artwork during that time. So why do I like this artwork so much? And three things I just mentioned. So yes, we do have the clocks, right? And they're going at it, and slowly, one thing is going to happen to one of the clocks, not to the other. The batteries will eventually die out in one clock, not the other, which is very much symbolistic to what happened to both of them, right? So, slowly this one ones start kind of, not working, while the other ones work fine, and eventually this one will start, slowing down, and then this one will stop altogether, right? Vice versa, depending on timing that the batteries were placed in there. Um, and it's always this echo, this repetition of the same story, of their story, right? The anguish, the loss, all of those things are repeated every single time that this artwork or this installation is being placed together in any of the galleries, right? And it's funny because, like I said, it's just two clocks, and when you receive this installation in your museum, the only thing that you have to do is make sure that you put the batteries at exactly the same time at 12 o'clock noon time or midnight time, and then just let them go, and then that's it. Now, as an artwork, this artwork is specifically 100% about time, right? It's the principal element of design of this artwork. Not only does it take time to experience it, meaning that you can come in the first day and see the clock's perfect synchronism. Months later, where they're kind of slowing down, or even after both of them stop working, it takes time for you to experience that. But also the meaning behind the clock is completely based on the concept of time, right? And how we experience time through our lives. It's a very powerful piece of artwork. If you, once again, if you go to museums and galleries in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you get to experience these two clocks as well, right? So they are part of the Rochaska collection in Dallas. So a beautiful, beautiful piece of artwork. The next one is what we call motion. So it's the next element of art is motion. You have two different kinds of motion. First of all, you have implied motion. There goes the word implied again. And implied motion is, for example, in this case, this is actually frozen in space. This is a sculpture by Swanson. It's called Untitled. And it is exactly as you see it. There is nothing holding the sculpture on top. There's absolutely nothing holding the sculpture on top. Right up here, there's nothing up there. The only thing that's holding the sculpture together is the little leg right there, right? So when you come into the gallery, it looks like this little goat's being pulled by this magician's cape, right? But it's not. It's completely frozen in space. So the motion of the sculpture is completely implied. Also, we have implied motion in paintings or in flat two-dimensional artworks. One of the times where you're going to see that motion was kind of the main subject matter that was being researched is during World War II, World War One, in the time of futurism in Europe. And futurists, artists who were doing futurism, were looking at how the world around them was moving faster and faster and faster with trains and planes and things like that. However, artwork was still very static. So they wanted to find ways on how to make art feel the movement, how to bring the artwork into the sense of movement of the contemporary time periods. So this is what basically was created. This shadows or echoes of the original to kind of give the sense of movement, right? Now we can say that photography aid with this concept, just because when you take a picture and somebody's moving or something's moving, you have the echo of the image behind it as well. So this is kind of derivative from that a little bit. Now, Because of this is that we actually have things like this, right? We have to understand the connectivity between the past, right, as well as our contemporary times. We, the sense of movement is thanks to the future. Now, that's implied motion. The next one is what we call actual motion, but we actually call it kinetic art. So anything, any artwork that has movement, we call kinetic art. And out of all the kinetic artists out there, the one that is the most iconic one is right here, Calder. So Calder was the person who took the mobile and created something that was extraordinary in the art world. Now, most of you have seen creating mobiles and in kindergarten class and stuff like that, and they seem to be like this really silly way of wasting time by creating something that's kind of visually kind of pretty and whatever. It's very much a waste of time. So we lost really the genius of what it was to have a mobile and why Calder was so his work was so well, I mean, coveted, and he was one of the greatest artists and conceptually. And the reason why I'm saying all of this, and let me explain it to you, why it was such a genius way of approaching art, is because during this time period, he was a modernist, right? And during the modern period, artists were basically editing things out, simplifying things out, simplifying subject matter to its most minimal of elements. And also we were having non-representational art. So all of those things were happening in this time period. So if you go into a gallery, stop again. So if you go into a gallery, right, and if you go to a gallery and you go from one painting to the next painting, to the next painting, to the next painting, to the next painting, and because they're all part of the same body of work, they're going to have very similar elements, right? During this time period of minimalism or abstraction and modernism, you would have a lot of shapes and paintings, right? So you would have a painting that is, black with red, a red line or whatever else, and then the other one would be very similar, and so forth and so on all the way around, right? So the genius with Calder, right, is that instead of you moving around the room, looking at different ways that a line, texture, color, form, all of those things were part of the composition, here can actually just stay in one spot and the composition would move for you, right? So instead of you moving around and see 20 different paintings, you can stay still and then see exactly a similar sense of the objects and the space that's been an illusion of two dimensions, but in this case, 3 dimensions and moving. Right? So in this case, the artwork moves and you stay still. Right? That is the genius of Calder. Right? These objects that are basically compositions in space, the same way that a painting has it, but then in order for them to move, quote unquote, then you have to go to the next painting and the next painting. So really interesting. And it's sad that our connection to mobiles is to kindergarten projects and not the genius of what Calder did. And last but not least, we've got light. Okay, so light is the last element of art that we're going to talk about. And you have to understand that light has two kind of functions. In some ways, light is just a way of highlighting the artwork, but it's very important how you add light to a sculpture or to a piece of artwork. So here, for example, when Lincoln, sorry, not Washington, Lincoln was originally displayed, the lighting of Lincoln was done from the bottom up. And unfortunately, Lincoln looked like he was surprised, right? It wasn't until the lighting was actually done from the top to the bottom that finally Lincoln looked like, he knew what he was doing, right? So lighting is very important. But as an actual medium, as an actual material to work with in a piece of artwork, here's a couple of artists that we're going to talk about. The first one is, in this case, going to be Plato, sorry, Dan Plato. And with his works, he's very minimalistic. He always thought that anybody has the ability to make a car with the most simplistic of objects. And he's completely right. The one thing that most people dismisses is his genius when it comes to um, thinking of light and its purity. So he's a minimalist art. Um, and we as art people who experience art tend to be in awe of how well a artist can render a painting, right? So it looks like all the colors are blended perfectly, and it looks like the petals have the right colors and all those things. But that always is mimicry of reality, right? So no matter how good a artist is with a brush and with imagination, all stuff, the artist can never be perfect with a brush and the paint, right? Especially when combining colors or describing how light really falls around an object. The only way that you can really truly do that is through reality, right? So Dan Flavin gives us that reality. So he gives us the preciousness of something as simple as light. So in here we have different colors, and we can experience the true beauty, right, of the mixture of color. Right? There's no man's imagination or hand in combining those colors. If we really truly like the perfection of light, the perfection of color mixture, then instead of looking at a painting of, I don't know, of a painter that paints this combination of colors, look at a Flavin. Look at how the color really truly mixes and interacts with the surface or with one another, right? So that's one of the beauties about Flavin's works and minimalist artists in general. There's a true humbleness to the reality of things. In this case, for example, color mixture, right? Light, obviously. Last artwork. Oh no, not last one. Almost there. Here's another artwork where art is a very important part of the medium. It's part of the composition. If we have no light with this other objects, then we wouldn't be see the shadow and the information for the artwork would be. So light in this case is also a medium, part of the materials in order to create the artwork. And here's the last one that I want to talk about. So in this scenario, one of the things about line is that talks about a point dragged through a surface, and sometimes the surface can be yes or no. It can be bent, and this is a great example of that line, that sense of surface where the surface really don't exist. The way that this work is made is you have basically a source of light here, and then you have mirrors, which the light is bounced back and forth between those mirrors. You have a camera, you open the aperture, and you take a very long picture, basically. And then the light is drawing, right, that information on the film. So first of all, this artwork is completely done with light. So the medium is light. But also, one of the things I did like to mention is that in this case, are there lines, right? Because a line is made, by dragging, right, doing all that. So you gotta be really mindful of those things when it comes to art. And artists are wanting normally to kind of undo those kind of definitions of what things are in order to move the ideas of art and beauty further ahead. So here's another artwork that uses line, not line. Well, it does use line, but light as a medium. Right, guys. So I know this is a fairly long PowerPoint. I appreciate you guys watching it, and ready for the next one.